The barn smelled like old hay and new fear. That's how a court clerk named Jonah Farwell described it in a letter to his brother in Boone, dated October the 14th, 1855. He wrote that letter the same night he finished transcribing the day's proceedings. Wrote it quickly, he said, before the images could settle too deep. He described the converted barn at the edge of the Watauga County seat, how the morning light came through the gaps in the siding in thin yellow blades, how the benches were packed with people who had ridden half a day through mountain roads just to see two boys sit in chains. He wrote, "I have kept court records for 11 years. I have never once felt the need to look away from a defendant's face. I looked away from theirs 3 times. The Honorable Thaddeus Monroe had been a traveling circuit judge for 22 years. He had presided over land disputes and murder trials, over the sentencing of men who deserved far worse than they received, and over the acquittal of men who deserved far worse than they escaped. He was 61 years old, heavyset, with a face like a topographic map of somewhere difficult to reach. He had accepted this assignment after the previous judge, a man named Alvin Crow, had submitted, in writing, a formal refusal. Judge Crow was not known as a man of sensitivity. His refusal cited only this: "I will not look at those boys again." Monroe arrived in Watauga County on the morning of October 12th. He spent 2 days reviewing the written evidence before the trial opened. Farwell noted that the judge ate very little during that period, and what he ate, he did not finish. When the proceedings began on October 14th, 1855, the first thing Judge Monroe did was read the charges aloud. He read them slowly. He read them the way a man reads the words on a gravestone. Not for information, because he already has it, but because some things deserve the weight of being spoken out loud. The charges were as follows: the destruction of property belonging to one Clement Adair of Burke County, a hunting camp and associated structures valued at $12.40, the theft of 7 horses from the same camp, the assault of one Samuel Teague, a licensed slave catcher operating under contract, resulting in injuries described as severe and lasting, the liberation, though the document used a different word, one we won't repeat here, of 4 enslaved persons being transported under Teague's authority, whose subsequent whereabouts remained unknown to the court, the disappearance of a traveling merchant named Obadiah Fenn of Tennessee, last seen on the Meat Camp Road in March of 1855, the disappearance of a man identified only as R. Holsclaw, a surveyor's assistant, in June of 1855. And then, Monroe paused. He set the document down on the desk in front of him, which was a plank stretched between 2 sawhorses. He looked up at the defendants for the first time. They looked back at him. Identical, 16 years old, hair the color of creek water in autumn, eyes that Farwell described in his letter as the particular gray of sky before weather, wrists in iron, seated side by side with perhaps 6 inches between them, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. One of them had not spoken a single word since being captured. Not one. He had been in custody for 19 days. He had eaten what was given to him, accepted water, looked at the men around him with an expression that no one could quite name. The sheriff had written in his report, "The quiet one does not appear frightened. He appears to be waiting." The other twin spoke, but only to his brother, only in a language that no one in the courtroom had ever heard before. and no one outside of 3 people in the history of Watauga County had ever been able to translate. Monroe read the final charge. The court transcript does not include the last item on the list. 3 pages of the original document are missing, pages 9, 10, and 11, possibly removed by the clerk's family at some later date, though Farwell's descendants have never confirmed or denied this. What we know of the final charge comes from Farwell's letter to his brother, in which he wrote only, "The last thing the judge read made a woman in the back row stand up and leave the barn. She did not come back. No one blamed her." Monroe set the document down a second time. He said, "How do the defendants plead?" The vocal twin turned to his brother. Something passed between them. Not a whisper, barely even a breath, but something. Then he turned back to the judge. He said, "We plead the truth." Monroe asked him to clarify. He said, "That's all we've got left to plead." The barn was absolutely still. Monroe looked at both boys for a long moment. Then he did something that no one in the room expected. He took off his reading spectacles, folded them, set them on his plank desk, and said, "Before we proceed to testimony, I want the record to note that I have reviewed the available evidence regarding these defendants' circumstances prior to the events in question. I intend for this court to hear that evidence in full. We will not understand the tree by looking only at the branch." The prosecuting attorney, a young man named Ferris Clay, who'd come up from Morganton specifically for this case, started to object. Monroe silenced him with a look that had 22 years of mountain roads behind it. "Mr. Clay," he said, "these are children. To understand what brought these boys to this barn, you have to go back 2 years and 60 miles east, to a farm that no longer exists. The Slade property sat at the end of a long rocky lane off the Tow River Road, in a hollow so deep in the Blue Ridge that the sun cleared the eastern ridge at nearly 9 o'clock and dropped behind the western one by 4 in the afternoon. In high summer, that hollow got maybe 7 hours of useful light. The rest of the time it existed in a kind of geological twilight, green and damp and heavy with the smell of cold stone and moving water. James Slade had worked that land for 18 years. He had cleared it himself with a brother who later moved to Tennessee and was never heard from again, had built the cabin with wood from his own trees, and notched the corners without help, and taught himself to do it straight. He was not a wealthy man by any measure used in 1853, but he was a competent one, and competent men in the Appalachian highlands were worth more than wealthy ones, because wealth required other people, and competence required only work. His wife, Ruth Slade, née Prater, was from a family that had been in Avery County, since before it was called Avery County. The Praters knew the mountains the way deep water fish know the floor of the ocean, not as a landscape, but as a body, as the thing they lived inside. Ruth was by all accounts a quiet woman, not given to complaint, who raised her twin sons with the same approach she used for the farm's more difficult tasks. You did what needed to be done. You did it without fuss. And you thanked God afterward for the strength to have done it. The twins were born in the winter of 1839. The birth was difficult. Ruth nearly died, and one of the boys arrived blue and silent, and required a good deal of work before he announced himself to the hollow with any kind of conviction. Ezra came first, loud and indignant. Enoch came 4 minutes later, quiet, as if he had stopped to consider the proposition, of entering the world and decided to do so on his own terms. They were, by every account we have, ordinary boys in most respects. They helped with farm work. They attended the small mountain schoolhouse, intermittently, when the weather permitted, and when the farm didn't need them more. They were known to disappear into the forest for hours at a time, which was not unusual for mountain children of that era, and to return with game, or simply with the untroubled look of boys who had found something satisfying in the woods. There are two records of the twins in the years before 1853. One is a brief notation in the schoolteacher's ledger. A man named Putnam Goss, who wrote that the Slade boys are clever but irregular attendees, and the quiet one in particular appears to learn by watching rather than by being told. The other is an entry in the Avery County Baptist Church membership rolls, noting the boy's baptism at age 11, both conducted without incident. That is the entirety of what the historical record offers about Ezra and Enoch Slade before the autumn of 1853. Before the fire. The fire started sometime in the night of September the 4th, 1853. No one saw it begin. By the time the nearest neighbor, a man named Calvin Prewitt, who lived nearly a mile away, saw the glow against the sky and understood what it was, the cabin was already fully involved. He ran. He arrived in time to see the roof fall in. He found no one outside, which meant, as far as Prewitt could tell in the chaos and the dark and the smoke, that James and Ruth Slade were still inside. They were. The twins were found at daylight by Prewitt and two other men who had come to help. They were sitting together on a flat rock near the creek, approximately 200 yards from the ruin of the cabin. They were dressed, which was notable, dressed in their work clothes, not their sleeping clothes. They were not injured. They were not weeping. They were sitting so close together that their shoulders touched, and they were speaking quietly to each other in the low, liquid syllables of the private language they had developed in early childhood. The men tried to speak with them. The boys looked up, answered basic questions, their names, their ages, that their parents had been inside the cabin, and then seemed to close themselves off, like shutters pulled over windows. They kept talking to each other. They did not stop until Calvin Prewitt gently separated them, taking each boy by a shoulder and turning them to face the smoking ruin. "You have to tell me," Prewitt said, according to his later deposition. "Were you inside when it started?" Ezra answered for both of them. "We were in the woods." "What were you doing in the woods in the middle of the night?" A pause. "Hunting." Prewitt looked at the boys. He looked at the ruin. He looked at the boys again. There is a note in his deposition, written years later, that reads, "I did not believe them. I also could not prove them false. I have thought about that moment many times since." The question of whether the fire was accidental has never been conclusively answered. James Slade had, in the years before his death, been involved in a land dispute with a man named Dorian Kopp, who claimed that approximately 40 acres of the Slade property's western edge had originally been surveyed as Koppland, and that James Slade's father had built a corner marker on false ground. The dispute had been ongoing for 3 years and had produced 2 fistfights and 1 formal complaint lodged with the county. 6 weeks before the fire, it had escalated. Kopp had allegedly told James Slade in front of 3 witnesses at the Linville store, that he would see the matter settled by whatever means come to hand. Dorian, cop, was questioned about the fire. He denied any involvement. No physical evidence connecting him to the fire was found, though it is worth noting that the investigation was brief and conducted by men who were his neighbors, and, in at least 2 cases, his relatives. The fire was ultimately recorded as accidental, attributed to an overturned lantern, though the Slade cabin's lantern was later found, intact and cold, near the creek, in a location that suggested it had been moved rather than dropped. No one pursued this further. James and Ruth Slade were buried in the Baptist Church Cemetery. Their land passed, through some murky arrangement involving distant relatives and county records, to Dorian Kopp within 14 months of their deaths. The twins, in the meantime, had been sent away. In the weeks after the fire, various members of the extended Slade and Prater families made claims on the boys. Mountain communities in 1850s western North Carolina operated their own informal systems of child welfare. Systems that were not cruel by intent, but were often brutal by circumstance, because the people taking in orphaned children were typically themselves operating at the edge of subsistence. Taking in another mouth was not nothing. It was a real sacrifice, and it came with an expectation of labor that we might today recognize as closer to indentured service than to child rearing. The decision to split the twins was made not out of malice, or at least we have no evidence of malice. The decision was made because there were 2 boys and 2 willing households, and the logic of distribution seemed sound to everyone involved. It was, in retrospect, the worst possible decision anyone could have made. Ezra was sent to his mother's sister, Martha Slade, who had married into the Slade name, and was therefore both a blood relation and a stranger to it, whose farm lay 14 miles north of Boone, in the Watauga County hills. Enoch was sent to the household of Reverend Abel Hicks, a Baptist minister, who ran a small congregation out of a converted mill building near the Elk River, some 12 miles in the other direction. The boys were separated on a cold October morning in 1853. Calvin Pruitt drove the wagon. He later said that neither boy cried. He said Ezra spent the entire journey looking at the road behind them, in the direction of Enoch's destination. He said Enoch, when Pruitt dropped him at the Reverend's door, stood in the yard and watched the wagon until it was out of sight, and then stood there a while longer. Like he was fixing the direction in his mind, Pruitt wrote, like he was memorizing which way to run. The first witness called by the prosecution was Martha Slade, the twins' maternal aunt. She was 43 years old, a large woman with hands that showed decades of hard work and a face that showed very little else. She had ridden to the county seat from her farm the day before the trial opened, stayed overnight with a cousin, and arrived at the barn that morning, wearing her church dress and an expression that Farwell described as a person who has made their peace with something and is waiting to find out if their peace was enough. Ferris Clay, the prosecuting attorney, asked her to describe her guardianship of Ezra Slade beginning in the autumn of 1853. Martha Slade said, "I took him in because there was no one else to take him." Clay pressed her. He wanted her to describe the boy's behavior, his temperament, his demeanor upon arrival. She said, "He was quiet. For the first month he was very quiet. He worked hard. I never had to tell him twice." Clay asked when she first noticed a change. Martha was silent for a moment, Then she said, "I don't know. As I can say there was one particular moment. I'd say it was more like water working on a stone. You don't see it happening. You just one day look at the stone and see it's different." Clay pressed her again on specific incidents. The record shows that she described, in response, the following events in the period of Ezra's time in her household. That Ezra began disappearing for stretches of time. Hours at first, then overnight, then occasionally for 2 or 3 days. Starting in the spring of 1854, that when he returned from these absences, he was always intact, sometimes with game, and would offer no explanation beyond "I was out." That she confronted him about this on multiple occasions, and that he listened to her with what she described as a patience that somehow felt worse than argument. That in July of 1854, a neighboring farmer named Cass Whitmire reported 3 of his chickens missing. That Whitmire came to Martha's door and accused Ezra. That Ezra denied it. That Martha believed her nephew but could offer nothing in his defense beyond her belief. That in September of 1854, she found in the old smokehouse she had not entered in some time a collection of items she could not explain. Several lengths of rope in specific knots she did not recognize, a folded piece of paper covered in markings that were not quite writing and not quite drawing, and a knife that had not come from her household. Clay asked her what she did with these items. Martha said, "I left them where I found them. I was afraid to touch them." Clay asked her if she had spoken to Ezra about what she'd found. She said, "I tried. He listened. He said they were his things, and they were not my concern." Clay leaned forward. He asked, "Mrs. Slade, were you frightened of your own nephew?" A very long pause. The barn was so quiet that Farwell wrote he could hear the horses outside shifting in their traces. Martha Slade said, "I was frightened of what he was becoming, which I think is different, though I'm not sure it matters now." Her eyes moved to the defendant's bench. The twins were watching her, both of them. Their faces showed nothing that any observer could subsequently agree on. Farwell wrote that they looked attentive. A woman named Hester Prewitt, who attended the trial and later wrote a brief account of it for a church newsletter, wrote that they looked hungry. The deputy guarding them that day, a man named Toby Ferris, told a reporter 2 years later that the look on their faces when Martha Slade spoke was the thing that stayed with him longest, and that the word he would use for it was grief. Defense counsel, an older local man named Garrison Webb, who had been appointed because no one else would take the case, asked Martha on cross-examination, "Mrs. Slade, how many hours per day did you require Ezra to work on your farm?" She said, "As many as the work required." Webb said, "Can you be more specific?" She said, "I am a widow running a hill farm alone. The work requires everything you have." Webb said, "Was Ezra attending school during his time with you?" "There wasn't time." "Was he attending church?" "Occasionally, when I could spare him." "Mrs. Slade, in the 14 months that Ezra Slade lived in your household, did you once ask him how he was faring?" The silence this time was of a different quality. Farwell wrote that it went on for perhaps 15 seconds, which in a crowded barn feels like considerably longer. Martha Slade said, "I assumed a working boy was a boy who had purpose. I thought purpose was the same as being all right." Webb said, "Thank you, Mrs. Slade." She stepped down from the witness chair. which was a milking stool someone had placed on a wooden platform, and as she passed the defendant's bench, she stopped. She stopped and looked at both boys. And then she did something that 3 separate observers noted in their later accounts. She said something to them, quietly, that no one else could hear. Farwell wrote, "I could not make out the words. I do not know what she said. I know that neither boy responded. But I also know that the one who does not speak, the quiet one, closed his eyes when she said it. Just for a moment, like someone who has waited a long time to hear something and finally hears it too late." Martha Slade's farm occupied 52 acres of rocky Watauga County hillside, of which perhaps 20 were genuinely arable, and the rest were a negotiation between stubbornness and geology. She had worked it with her late husband until he died of a chest ailment in 1851, and since his death she had worked it alone, with occasional hired help from neighbors who were usually in need of something in return, and therefore not entirely cheap. She was not, by the evidence, a deliberately cruel woman. She did not beat Ezra. She did not starve him. She gave him a corner of the house to sleep in, a blanket and a straw tick, and she fed him the same things she fed herself, which were adequate if not generous. What she did do from the first week was work him. Ezra rose before light. He split firewood, fed the animals, carried water, cleared drainage ditches, repaired fencing, turned soil, hauled stone, cut hay, and performed the 100 other tasks that a hill farm requires in continuous rotation. He did this without complaint, at least initially. Martha later acknowledged that he was as capable a farmhand as any adult she had hired, possibly more so, because he never argued and never left the work half done. What she did not do, what no one in Ezra Slade's life in that period did, was speak to him as if he were a person who had lost something. He had lost his parents. He had lost his home. He had lost his brother. He had lost the only world he had ever known, in a single night, and he had been placed into a new one that asked him only for his labor and offered him nothing in return except the continuation of that asking. In mountain communities of the 1850s, grief was not a subject that received much direct attention. People understood that it existed. They simply did not have the framework, or perhaps the leisure, to examine it carefully. Children, especially orphaned children taken in by working households, were expected to absorb their losses the way they absorbed hard weather. You put your head down, you kept moving, and eventually the storm passed. If it didn't pass, that was a private matter between you and God could be petitioned on Sundays. Ezra Slade was 14 years old, orphaned, separated from the only other person who had ever truly known him, working 14-hour days in a hollow he had never seen before, sleeping in a corner of a stranger's house. And the world asked of him only that he continue to be useful. He continued to be useful. And in the margins of that usefulness, in the hours before dawn, and in the long nights and in whatever time he could carve, out of the edges of required labor, he began to build something else. The disappearances started in the late winter of 1854. First, just an hour or two at the end of the day, when the light had gone gray and cold and Martha was in the house. He went into the woods behind the farm, and he didn't come back until she called. Then the absences stretched. An hour became 2, became 3. He began ranging farther from the farm, up into the ridges, into the deep timber where the light barely reached even in summer. What was he doing up there? The court records, the testimony, and the available secondary sources don't give us a clean answer to this. What we can say with some confidence, based on the evidence introduced at trial, is this: he was learning. The mountains of Watauga County in the 1850s were not empty wilderness. They were inhabited and traversed by all manner of people. Cherokee families who remained in the region despite the removal policies of prior decades, using routes and knowledge that predated the roads by centuries. Hunters and trappers who operated on the margins of settled life. Irregular travelers moving goods or people through the mountain passes for reasons they preferred not to explain. And in 1854, increasingly, people connected to what would later be formalized as the Underground Railroad. Men and women moving north through the mountains, and the other men and women who were helping them do it. We know Ezra encountered some of these people in the woods. We know this because of what was found in the smokehouse. The specific knots in those lengths of rope, which were later identified by a man named Thomas Caleb Hart as trail marking techniques used by guides on mountain freedom routes. We know it because of the paper, with markings on it, which appears to have been a rough map, though of what terrain and toward what purpose has never been established. What does a 14-year-old orphan, isolated and overworked and grieving and angry, do when he encounters a world operating entirely outside the rules of the society that has failed him? In Ezra Slade's case, he paid very close attention. 12 miles in the other direction from where Ezra was learning the language of the ridge, Enoch Slade was learning something different. Reverend Abel Hicks was 48 years old when Enoch came to live with him. A tall, thin man with a scholar's stoop and hands that seemed disproportionately large for his frame, as if they belonged to a bigger, louder version of himself that had been compressed into a quieter body. He was not married. He had, over the years, taken in several orphaned or abandoned children, and the community regarded this as evidence of his Christian charity, which it was, in the way that a net is a tool for catching something, and also, secondarily, a prison for the thing it catches. Hicks had studied theology at a small college in Wilkesboro before returning to the mountains of his birth. He believed, with the thorough and immovable conviction of a man who has organized his entire interior life around a single principle, that the human soul was naturally bent toward darkness, and that the job of a righteous man was to unbend it by whatever means God placed at hand. He was not sadistic. This is important to understand, or perhaps it makes things worse to understand. He was not sadistic. He genuinely believed that what he was doing was necessary and good. He believed that suffering, correctly administered, was not cruelty, but medicine. He believed that the cure for a soul's darkness was to drive it out with light, and that if the patient found the light uncomfortable, that was simply evidence that the darkness was present and resisting treatment. Enoch Slade had arrived at Hicks's door already quiet. He left it 14 months later in a silence so complete and so particular that the Reverend himself, testifying at trial, would describe it as a kind of triumph, though I now understand I was wrong about whose victory it was. The first weeks were not markedly unusual. Hicks fed Enoch, gave him a room, an actual room, which was a better material situation than Ezra's corner at Martha's, and introduced him to a daily schedule organized entirely around religious observance and study. Morning prayers before dawn, scripture reading before breakfast, work during the day. Hicks's establishment required maintenance and had a small garden. Followed by evening prayers and, 3 times a week, what Hicks called directed reflection, which involved sitting alone in the small study room with a passage of scripture and writing down one's thoughts on it until Hicks determined the exercise was complete. Enoch participated in all of this with the same compliance he brought to everything. He was quiet. He was still. He wrote what he was asked to write. He said what he was asked to say. Hicks interpreted this as a promising spiritual constitution. The problem, from Hicks's perspective, began in February of 1854, when Enoch began having nightmares. We know about the nightmares from Hicks's own personal diary, which was entered into evidence at trial, and which is, in retrospect, a far more revealing document about Hicks than about Enoch. Hicks wrote that Enoch woke screaming on multiple nights. Screaming, and then, upon being shaken awake, immediately going silent in a way that Hicks found more disturbing than the screaming. He wrote that Enoch spoke during sleep, sometimes in English and sometimes in a language Hicks could not identify, and that the words in English, when Hicks could make them out, were almost always the same. Ezra, Ezra, Ezra. Hicks's response to this was to increase the directed reflection time and to introduce what he called purification practices. These began with extended fasting. Enoch was restricted to water and plain broth on alternating days during a period Hicks described as cleansing weeks. They progressed to what Hicks termed cold immersion, which the court record makes clear was the forced submersion of Enoch in the cold water cistern behind the house, in temperatures that, in February of 1854 in the Elk River Valley, were somewhere between 35 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Hicks described this practice in his diary as the water drives the fever of sin from the body and creates space for the Holy Spirit to enter. He described Enoch's response to it as acceptance, which is the beginning of holiness. What we do not have, and this gap is one of the most haunting in the entire record, is any account from Enoch himself of this period. We have Hicks's diary, we have Hicks's testimony, we have the notes of the circuit court physician who examined Enoch upon his capture in 1855 and noted, among other things, scarring on the right wrist consistent with extended pressure from a restraint, and 2 healed rib fractures of uncertain origin. We have, from Lahi French's testimony, a single phrase that she said Enoch used to describe this period of his life in the moments in the cave when they talked. She said he used the twin language for it, but that he had taught her enough by then to understand. She translated it for the court as, "The time I learned to be somewhere else while my body stayed." The Reverend Hicks arrived at the trial on the second day, dressed in his ministerial clothes, a black coat that might have once been fine and had since become merely correct, carrying his Bible and wearing the expression of a man who believes he is about to receive credit for something. He did not receive credit for anything. Ferris Clay questioned him carefully. Clay was not, on reflection, an unsympathetic man. He was a young attorney who believed in the law's capacity to do justice and who found, in this case, the law's capacity to be insufficient, but who pressed forward because he believed that was his job. He asked Hicks about Enoch's time in his household. He asked carefully. He asked about the religious practices. He asked about the purification regime. Hicks described everything with the serene composure of a man who has never once questioned his own righteousness. Clay introduced Hicks's diary into evidence. Hicks's composure shifted slightly, the way a building shifts slightly in an earthquake. Not collapsing, but showing, for the first time, that it might. Garrison Webb's cross-examination was not lengthy. Webb was an older man, more comfortable with land records than with criminal proceedings, but he understood people, and he had read Hicks's diary twice before taking the stand. He asked Hicks, "Reverend, how many times did you submerge Enoch Slade in the cold cistern?" Hicks said, "I don't recall an exact number." Your diary records 17 separate occasions between February and September of 1854. A pause. If that is what the diary records, then that is accurate. How long was each immersion? Until the practice had achieved its purpose. Reverend, what was the temperature of the cistern water in February? I couldn't say precisely. Would you say it was warm water? No. Reverend Hicks. Webb paused. He was looking at his notes, but the pause felt deliberate, as if he were giving the room time to settle around the question he was about to ask. Enoch Slade was 14 years old. His parents had just died. He had been separated from his only brother. He was having nightmares in which he called his brother's name. And your response to these nightmares was to put him in cold water and restrict his food. Is that an accurate summary of your treatment of this child? Hicks said, "My response to evidence of spiritual disturbance was to apply the remedies that Scripture and experience prescribe." Webb said, "Yes or no, Reverend?" A very long pause. The summary is reductive, but not inaccurate. Hicks did not answer. Webb said, "Thank you, Reverend. No further questions." Hicks stepped down from the milking stool with the careful movements of a man who is physically fine, but has just been told something about himself that he will spend a great deal of time attempting to re-examine in private. As he passed the defendant's bench, Enoch Slade, the quiet twin, the one who had not spoken a word in 19 days, did something that everyone in the barn noted in whatever account they later left. He turned his head and watched Hicks walk past him. Just watched him, with those gray eyes that everyone described differently. And Hicks, passing within 3 feet of the boy, did not look at him. Not once. He walked with his eyes fixed on the far wall of the barn and did not look at Enoch Slade, and the room understood, without needing to be told, that this was not carelessness. It was a specific and deliberate inability to bear looking. Farwell wrote, "I have watched a great many witnesses testify. I have never seen a witness flee from the defendant while still walking at a normal pace. But that is what I saw today." They saw each other for the first time since the separation in late June of 1854 at the Mountain Creek Baptist Church's summer gathering, an annual event that drew families from across the ridges, a combination of religious observance and the purely secular human need to see other people after a long winter and spring spent mostly alone. Martha brought Ezra because it was expected of her, and also because she had noticed, in the past weeks, a quality in him that she could not quite name, but that she registered as pressure. The specific pressure of something that is either going to be released or is going to find its own way out. She thought a gathering might help. She was not wrong, though the help it provided was not the kind she had imagined. Hicks brought Enoch for similar reasons, though his stated reason was the importance of communal worship. His private diary entry from the week before the gathering suggests he was also hoping that the social contact might soften what he was beginning to describe in his own writing as an alarming interiority in his charge. We don't know exactly when the twins spotted each other. The gathering was large enough that in the early part of the day, people moved around freely between the churchyard and the adjacent field where tables had been set up for the midday meal. Several witnesses later described seeing the moment, or something like it, but the accounts disagree on specifics in ways that suggest different people saw different parts of the same event. What everyone agrees on is this. At some point in the middle of the afternoon, the two boys were found together at the far edge of the churchyard, near the cemetery fence, sitting in the grass with their backs to the gathering and speaking to each other in the twin language so rapidly and with such apparent urgency that it had drawn a small semicircle of curious onlookers who kept a respectful but clearly uncomfortable distance. Calvin Prewitt, who had attended the gathering and who was watching this with the particular attention of a man who has already thought more than he wanted to about these two boys, later wrote, "I couldn't hear the words from where I stood. I could hear the sound of them, though, and the sound was like two streams meeting after a long dry spell. All rush and tumble, and the particular noise of water finding its level. Martha reached Ezra and took him by the arm to pull him away for dinner. He stood without resistance. As he stood, he reached down and briefly gripped Enoch's hand, the way you grip something you're about to have to let go of, and then released it. Enoch turned, for the first time, to look at the gathered adults. Then he looked back at his brother. He said something in the twin language briefly. Ezra said, in English, "I know." Hicks stepped forward and escorted Enoch away. Neither boy looked back. Calvin Prewitt wrote, "I don't know what the quiet one said to his brother. I know how Ezra's face changed when he said it. It was the face of a boy who has been told something he already suspected and who is now furious in the particular way of someone whose worst fears have been confirmed." After that gathering, the pattern of the boys' absences changed. Martha had already grown accustomed to Ezra disappearing into the hills for stretches of time. After the June gathering, the disappearances became longer and more deliberate. He would leave on a Friday evening and return on a Sunday. He would leave in rain that should have kept anyone indoors and return dry, which meant he knew where shelter was in the mountains. He brought back food, not always game, sometimes roots and berries and dried things she didn't recognize, and he ate separately from her, quickly, and then slept. 12 miles away, Hicks noticed the same change in Enoch. The boy had previously been reliably present. Where else did he have to go? But beginning in July of 1854, he began disappearing too. Hicks noted this in his diary with increasing alarm. Enoch would complete his morning duties and then, at some point in the day, simply not be where Hicks expected him to be. He was never gone overnight. He always returned by dark, but the hours of his absence were unaccountable, and he offered no explanation, and Hicks's attempts to extract one through the purification practices produced only the same complete, terrible silence that had been building in the boy for months. What the twins were doing in those hours, those days, those stretches of mountain time, what they were building together in the hollows and ridges between their two households, is the question at the heart of everything that followed. The court tried to answer it. It answered it only partially. What we know, from the physical evidence, from the testimony, and from what Lahi French would later say, the twins had found each other in the mountains. They had found a network of trails that connected the two households through the deep back country, trails that avoided roads and farms and the eyes of adults entirely. They had established meeting places, at least 3, possibly more, in the cave systems that honeycombed the limestone beneath the Watauga ridgelines. They had been, in the intervals between their 2 separate captivities, building something, a world of their own. And in that world, governed by a language no one else spoke, by knowledge learned from the margins of a society that had discarded them, and by the specific ferocity of 2 people who have been separated and have found each other again, something was growing. Something that could still, at that point, have been almost anything. The court transcript for the afternoon of October 15th breaks off at what appears to be mid-sentence in the examination of a minor witness, a farmhand named Eli Coates, who had briefly worked on Martha Slade's property, and picks up again at the start of proceedings on October 16th. 3 pages. Missing. Farwell's letter to his brother contains only a brief reference to the afternoon session of October 15th, which he describes as unpleasant testimony regarding physical conditions on the Slade farm and at the Hicks establishment, details of which I will spare you. His next letter, written a week later, mentions that he learned, after the trial concluded, that one of the jurors, a man whose name Farwell declines to record, had spent the night of October 15th sitting outside his own children's rooms, watching them sleep. We cannot know what those 3 missing pages contained. We can note that the following morning, October 16th, Judge Monroe began the day's proceedings by issuing an unusual statement. He said, for the record, "This court has heard evidence sufficient to establish that both defendants were subjected, during the formative period preceding the events under examination, to conditions that no court of conscience can regard as neutral. This finding does not bear on the question of the defendant's actions or culpability. It bears on the question of how this court and this community understand those actions. We will proceed." Ferris Clay looked at his notes. Then he called the next witness. The first incident that attracted community attention occurred in late October of 1854, approximately 13 months after the twins' parents died. A farmer named Whitley Burke, whose property sat between the 2 main ridges about 4 miles north of Boone, found 3 of his pigs dead in the pen one morning. Not butchered, not stolen, which would have made obvious sense, but killed in a way that Burke described as like something was practicing. The wounds were methodical. The animals had been killed precisely, without apparent struggle, using what the local doctor, who was consulted, identified as bladed instruments. Burke suspected wolves, and then reconsidered when someone pointed out that the fence showed no signs of forced entry. He suspected his neighbors, and then reconsidered when no one in the county had obvious motivation. The incident was noted, worried over, and ultimately filed away in the community's collective memory as one of those things that happen and don't get explained. 2 weeks later, a trapper named Orrin Fitch found his trap lines disturbed. not destroyed, carefully, deliberately reset in different locations, with modifications to the anchor systems that Fitch, a man who had been trapping these ridges for 30 years, said he had never seen before. But that worked, upon reflection, better than his own methods. He was more puzzled than angry. He mentioned it at the mill. A few people laughed. The story was forgotten. In December, a traveling preacher passing through on the Elk River Road arrived at the next settlement with a story. 2 boys, identical, had appeared at the edge of his camp at night. He had spoken to them. They had not answered. They had simply stood at the tree line looking at him. And then they were gone. And he had traveled an extra 6 miles out of his way to avoid passing through that stretch of road again after dark. These incidents existed in the autumn and winter of 1854 as separate, unconnected events in different people's awareness. Nobody was yet connecting them. Nobody was yet saying a name. That changed in the spring of 1855. The spring of 1855 in Watauga County was a season of accumulating worry in ways that had nothing to do with the twins. The political tensions that had been building through the decade, the argument over slavery that was slowly and inexorably splitting not just the nation, but the mountain communities themselves, where opinions did not run as uniformly as the flatland states liked to imagine, were making themselves felt in specific and local ways. The Underground Railroad routes through the Western Carolina mountains had become more active. There were men in Watauga County who were actively helping people escape north through the ridges, and there were men in Watauga County who were actively trying to stop this. And the men in these 2 groups sometimes lived within shouting distance of each other and went to the same churches. Samuel Teague was not from Watauga County. He was a hired slave catcher from the South Carolina Lowcountry who had been operating in the Western Carolina mountains for 2 years, contracted by a consortium of plantation owners whose human property kept disappearing into the hills. He was effective at his work, which required a specific combination of tracking skills, ruthlessness, and the particular ability to make people talk who would rather not. He had, by his own accounting, returned 31 people to captivity in 2 years of mountain operation. He was not, by any measure available to us, a good man. He arrived in Watauga County in February of 1855 with a contract for 4 specific people: a man, a woman, and 2 children who had been reported moving north through the mountain routes. He established a base camp in the Elk River watershed near the Kopp property. Dorian Kopp, who had acquired the Slade farmlands after the fire, appears in multiple records as a man with consistent sympathy for the slave-catching operations, which tells us something about the community's internal politics that the community itself preferred not to examine, and began his work. For several weeks, Teague's operation proceeded without notable incident. He gathered information from cooperative locals. He followed leads. He tightened his net. And then, in early March of 1855, something interrupted him. The night of March 12th, 1855, was overcast and cold, with a wind coming down off the grandfather mountain face that made the temperature feel worse than the thermometer suggested. Samuel Teague had by that evening located his quarry, the family he'd been contracted to find, and had them secured in a holding pen he had constructed for this purpose, a wooden structure attached to one end of his camp building. He had one hired hand with him, a man named Eli, who appears in the court records only by his first name, and who, notably, was never called as a witness because he could not subsequently be found. They were camped in a shallow draw that backed against a limestone cliff face. Good shelter from the wind, concealed from the road, accessible by a single trail through dense timber. Teague had chosen it for its defensibility because he was a practical man who understood that his work made him enemies. What happened that night is the subject of disputed testimony. What is not disputed? In the morning, when a local man named Greer came to the camp on an errand, he found the holding structure destroyed, not just opened, but taken apart, with a systematic thoroughness that suggested time and planning rather than desperate force. The camp itself was in significant disarray. Teague was present, injured. Eli was not. The 4 people who had been in the holding pen were gone. What Teague told Greer that morning, he had been attacked in the night by a group of men. Abolitionists, he said. Underground railroad operatives, he said. 8 or 10 of them, armed. He said they had overpowered him, beaten him, destroyed the camp, and freed his captives. He said Eli had run at the first sight of them, and he hadn't seen him since. What the physical evidence suggested to anyone who looked carefully. The attack had involved a maximum of 2 people, based on footprint analysis conducted by a man named Harlan Church, who had been a tracker for 30 years and who gave informal testimony at the trial that was not entered into the official record, but which appears in Farwell's correspondence. Church said that 2 sets of prints, both barefoot, both consistent with young adults or older children, had approached the camp from 2 different directions, converged on the holding structure, and departed together on a trail heading up into the ridge. The 4 people who had been in Teague's holding pen were never recovered by him. They were never identified in subsequent records. They had moved north and disappeared into whatever network of safe houses and mountain paths ran north toward freedom. And they are, as far as we have been able to determine, free. If they had descendants, and they likely did, those descendants are living somewhere right now, unaware that 2 unnamed boys in an unnamed cave in Watauga County, North Carolina, in 1855, changed the course of their family's history in a night. This is the moment in the story of Ezra and Enoch Slade that resists easy interpretation. And it should resist it, because the same 2 boys who would subsequently be charged with the disappearance of at least 2 men, charges that the available evidence, for all its gaps, makes difficult to entirely dismiss, are the same 2 boys who, on a cold night in March, destroyed a man's camp and freed 4 people who had no other hope of freedom. The same intelligence that was apparently being directed toward something terrible was, at that moment, directed toward something that we cannot, from any moral vantage point, call wrong. This is the question Judge Monroe would eventually have to sit with. What do you do with children who have committed both? What does the law do when the same hands that freed the innocent may also have destroyed the guilty? Teague was a large man, powerfully built, with a permanent squint from years of work in bright outdoor light, and hands that were both a tradesman's tools and, several observers noted, instruments that had clearly been applied to purposes beyond ordinary work. He walked with a slight hitch in his right leg that had not been there before March. He wore his injury with the specific pride of a man who wants the injury to communicate something about his toughness rather than his defeat, but was not entirely succeeding. He was, from the first minute, the most volatile witness the trial produced. Clay questioned him about the camp incident. Teague described it with the expansive confidence of a man who has told a story enough times to have stopped distinguishing it from what actually happened. He talked about the group of attackers, the 8 or 10 men, the abolitionists, the violence of the assault. He used the word animals twice. Clay did not challenge him on the number. Clay was interested in the outcome, not the means. He asked Teague, "To your knowledge, who was responsible for the attack on your camp?" Teague said, "Not to my knowledge, certainly to my suspicion." Clay asked him to elaborate. Teague said, "I tracked the prints. I'm a tracker. 2 people, young by the weight and the size of the foot, and the way the structure was taken apart." He paused, as if deciding something. "I've seen good work, and I've seen bad work in my field, and I've seen the work of people who know what they're doing. Whoever took that pen apart knew what they were doing. They knew about locks, and they knew about construction, and they knew how to move quiet. That is not the skill set of improvised compassion. That is learned skill." Clay asked, "Is it your testimony that the Slade twins were responsible for this attack?" Teague said, "I'll leave the word responsible for the lawyers." When Garrison Webb cross-examined him, the proceedings entered what Farwell later called the most legally peculiar 30 minutes I have witnessed in 11 years of keeping records. Webb asked Teague, "Mr. Teague, you described the people you were transporting as your captives. Under what legal authority were they held?" Teague cited his contract. Webb asked, "And the people themselves, were they from North Carolina? Tennessee? Were they residents of Watauga County?" "No." "Had they committed any act within Watauga County for which they might be legally detained?" "They were property. They were human beings, Mr. Teague." The barn erupted. Monroe gavelled for order. It took a while to arrive. When the noise settled, Webb continued, "Mr. Teague, you've testified that unknown individuals freed 4 people from your custody. My question is, given that those 4 individuals were being transported without consent against their own will, is it possible that what you are describing as a crime was not a crime? Is it possible that what the defendants, if they were the defendants, which you yourself have declined to confirm, is it possible that what they did was not wrong?" Teague said, "I'm a licensed operator under state and federal law. That wasn't my question." Teague looked at him. He looked at the twins. He said, in a voice that was quieter than anything else he'd said, "A lot of things in this life are legal that aren't right, and a lot of things are illegal that aren't wrong. I've always known the difference. I just worked the legal side of it." Webb said, "Thank you, Mr. Teague. That will be all." What happened next is not in the court transcript. It is in Farwell's letter. He writes, "After Teague stepped down, Ezra Slade turned in his chains and looked at the prosecution table, and then at the defense table, and then at the judge, and he said, loudly enough for the room to hear, 'We freed them. We are not sorry for it.' Monroe looked at defense counsel, who looked at his client, and Ezra said, 'I know it's not helping us.' And then he turned to his brother and said something in that language of theirs, and the quiet one, and this is what I keep thinking about, what I keep coming back to. The quiet one almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. After the camp incident, something shifted. The shift is difficult to characterize from the outside because we are working with fragments, court testimony, depositions, physical evidence, the observations of people who were watching the twins after the fact, who were constructing a narrative backward from an outcome. The honest thing to say is, we don't know exactly when the twins' actions moved from something morally ambiguous into something else. We don't know if there was a line, or where it was, or whether they knew they were crossing it. What we know is what the physical record shows, and what witnesses subsequently described. Obadiah Fenn was a traveling merchant from Tennessee. Fabrics and small dry goods, mostly, a man who worked a circuit of mountain towns 3 or 4 times a year. He was described in the missing person notice filed by his family as a compact man of 50 years, red-haired, traveling with a bay mule named Silas. He was last seen on the Meat Camp Road on a Tuesday in March 1855, 3 days after the camp incident, by a farmer who exchanged a brief greeting with him as he passed. He was never seen again. The mule was found 3 weeks later, tethered in good health outside a farmhouse 6 miles off the road, with its packs still attached and their contents intact. The Fenn case was the first disappearance that generated a formal inquiry. The constable who conducted it, a man named Abner Kalk, interviewed 23 people over 4 weeks and reached no conclusions. His report notes, as a curiosity, that several people along the Meat Camp Road had mentioned seeing 2 young men, alike as mirrors, moving off the road into the timber on the day Fenn passed, but that no one could confirm a connection between this sighting and Fenn's disappearance. Kalk's report also notes, in a section that appears to have been added after the main body of the document, I spoke with Martha Slade regarding the whereabouts of her ward Ezra on the relevant dates. She stated she could not confirm his location. She appeared distressed. R. Holsclaw was a surveyor's assistant, age approximately 30, who had been hired by a land company with interests in northern Watauga County to assist with a boundary survey of several properties. The surveyor he worked for was a man named Amos Bell, who later provided the only direct account we have of Holsclaw's last day. He had sent Holsclaw ahead to mark some stakes on a property near a particular ridge, while Bell returned to their camp for equipment. When Bell arrived at the ridge 2 hours later, the stakes were properly marked and Holsclaw was gone. I assumed he had walked back by a different path. Bell said, I waited until evening. He didn't come. The connection of Holsclaw's disappearance to the Slade twins was made by the constable in a second investigation conducted in July 1855, when community concern had reached a level that demanded official attention. Kalk interviewed all available witnesses a second time. He obtained from Calvin Prewitt the information about the twins' history. He spoke with Martha, who this time did not attempt to protect her nephew, and told him about the absences and the smokehouse discoveries. He spoke with a man named Lester Good, who had, in May, encountered 2 identical young men on a ridge trail and described a quality in the encounter that he called, like meeting something that is deciding something about you. Kalk organized a search. He assembled 12 men with dogs. He knew roughly where to look. the cave systems in the limestone ridges between the two households had been mentioned by multiple people in their accounts of the twins' movements. The dogs found the trails. The trails went into the mountains. The mountains, in the summer of 1855, did not give up what was in them. The search came back without the twins, and without answers, and with one piece of physical evidence. In a shallow cave about 4 miles off the road, they found the remains of a small camp, 2 sleeping rolls, a fire ring, the scattered bones of what appeared to be a deer or large dog, and scratched into the cave wall in the twins' private language what appeared to be an extensive inscription of some kind. No one could read it. The inscription has never been translated. A photograph of it, made several years later by a regional historian, exists in the North Carolina State Archives. A linguist who examined it in 1921 described it as a fully developed phonemic system with consistent internal logic, not a childhood cipher, but a genuine private language of considerable sophistication. He estimated that its development would have required years of consistent use and conscious elaboration. 2 boys, separated, working in parallel, building a language that no adult had given them, and no adult could understand. The inscription on the cave wall was the last thing the searchers found. They came down from the mountains and reported that the twins had gone deeper, into cave systems that nobody with good sense followed in summer, because the deep caves of Watauga County flooded unpredictably, and because you could get turned around in them and walk in circles until your torch went out, and because the dark in those caves was the absolute dark of the earth's interior, and in that dark, the mountains kept their own counsel about what they held. There is one name in the record that does not fit the pattern of the rest. Lahi French was 14 years old in the summer of 1855. She was the daughter of a widower farmer named Garrett French, who owned a property bordering the northeastern edge of Martha Slade's land, a proximity that had given Lottie, over the previous year, occasional views of Ezra working the fields, and, on a handful of notable occasions, brief encounters with him at the fence line that separated the 2 properties. She was, by the account of everyone who described her, a different kind of person from most of the people in this story. The circuit judge's notes describe her as possessed of an unusual directness, not defiant, but thorough, the kind of person who asks the real question, while others are still asking the preparatory one. Her neighbor, Hester Pruitt, described her as the sort of child who could make you say more than you intended to simply by waiting. Lottie had, apparently, been quietly curious about the twins for a long time. She had seen Ezra at the fence and spoken with him. She had asked him, at some point in the spring of 1854, about the words he muttered to himself when he was working, the fragments of the twin language he was apparently unable to entirely suppress even when alone. She had asked him what they meant. He had told her, "They mean whatever needs saying." She had said, "Teach me." According to her later testimony, he had stared at her for a long time. Then he had said, "Why?" She had said, "Because it sounds like something worth knowing." He hadn't answered that day, but over subsequent fence line encounters that were apparently entirely clandestine and that Martha Slade was unaware of, he had begun, in small pieces, to teach her. Not systematically, not with the intent of giving her fluency, but enough that, by the summer of 1855, she could follow the rough direction of a conversation in the twin language even if she couldn't construct one herself. This is the thing about Lahi French that Farwell, in his letter, returns to again and again. She was the only person who had tried. The only one who had looked at this boy, this angry, watchful, armored boy, and instead of being afraid of what she saw, had simply asked to be let in. He had let her in, a little, just enough. In August of 1855, a month before the twins were captured, Lottie did something that no adult in the community had managed to do. She found them. She had been paying attention. She had noticed the trails. She had noticed the direction of the absences. She had noticed in the way that observant 14-year-olds notice things that careful adults miss. The specific quality of the rock face to the northeast, the way water ran off it in rain, the dark seams that suggested openings beneath. She had explored on her own, carefully, for several weeks. And she had found the entrance to the cave system that the twins had been using as their deepest sanctuary. She went in alone. She went in with 2 torches and a canteen and a piece of cornbread because she was 14 and she was afraid, and she was also the kind of person who prepared for what she was afraid of rather than avoiding it. The cave entrance was a narrow, horizontal slot in a limestone cliff face, easily overlooked from the outside, barely wide enough to enter sideways. Beyond the slot, the rock opened up, not dramatically, not a great cathedral cavern, but significantly, enough that a person could stand and move and breathe without the walls pressing in. The floor was flat in places, sculpted limestone worn smooth by centuries of underground water. She heard them before she saw them. Speaking in the twin language, the rapid, liquid conversation she had heard in fragments at the fence line, and stopped at the edge of the torchlight, beyond which the cave curved away into darkness, and she called Ezra's name. The voices stopped. The silence was absolute in the way that underground silence is absolute, not just the absence of sound, but the presence of a depth that sound cannot reach. She called again. Then, after perhaps 30 seconds, a torch appeared around the curve of the cave, and then Ezra appeared holding it, and then Enoch appeared behind him. They looked at her. She looked at them. She later described this moment at trial. She described the physical details carefully. That Ezra was taller than he'd been at the fence line. That Enoch stood slightly behind his brother and slightly to the left. That both of them were thin in a way that was beyond the ordinary thinness of farm boys. That Enoch had a healing cut on his forearm that had not been treated properly and would scar. She described the cave around them, the flat sleeping area, the fire ring, the things hanging from the walls, not threatening things as it turned out, but practical ones. Maps, lengths of rope, a small collection of tools, the kind of camp that someone builds when they intend to stay in a place and want it to work properly. She described, with the careful precision of someone who has thought about it for a very long time, the look on both boys' faces when they saw her. She said, "They looked like they had been waiting for someone who wasn't frightened of them. And they looked like they had stopped believing that person was coming." She held out the cornbread. Enoch looked at it for a moment. Then he moved forward and took it from her hand. He looked at it. He looked at her. And then, according to Lottie, who told this detail, with a steadiness in her voice that the court clerk noted with some care, he said something to her in the twin language, She understood enough of it. She answered him in what she could manage of it, which, apparently, was sufficient, because he stepped back and looked at his brother. What passed between the twins in that moment, in the language no one else spoke, is another gap in the record. Lottie said she understood some of it, that it involved something about her, something about trust, something about whether it was time. She said she didn't understand all of it, and that she deliberately didn't try to parse every word because she understood that some of it was not for her. Ezra looked at her for a long time. Then he said, in English, "You know they'll say we did terrible things." She said, "Did you?" A pause. He looked at his brother. He looked back at her. "Some of them weren't terrible," he said. She said, "I know." He said, "Some of them were." She said, "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you afraid of us?" She thought about it, really thought about it. The way she did things, slowly and thoroughly. Then she said, "I'm more afraid of what happened to you than of what you are now, and I think those are connected." Neither boy said anything for a while. Then Enoch, the silent one, the one who had not spoken to any adult in over a year, the one who had been submerged in cold water 17 times as a remedy for the grief of losing his parents. Enoch looked at Lahi French and said in English, his voice rusty with disuse, "How did you find us?" She said, "I paid attention." He said, "No one ever paid attention before." Farwell's letter contains this detail, relayed from Lottie's testimony. She said the quiet one, the one who never spoke, asked her very quietly if Martha Slade was well. He asked specifically about the aunt, not about the Reverend. She said yes, as far as she knew. He said, "She worked Ezra too hard, but she wasn't unkind, not in her heart." And then he said, "Tell her he doesn't blame her." Lottie said she asked him, "Does he know that himself?" And the boy said, "He will, when it's over." She asked them to come with her. She asked it without conditions, without promises she couldn't keep, without telling them it would be all right because she was 14 and smart enough to know that it would not be all right. She said, "I think it's time for you to stop running. I think you're tired." Ezra looked at his brother. The twins had an entire conversation in the twin language, brief and intense and focused. Lottie waited. She did not rush them. She held her torch and waited. And she later said that the waiting was the most important thing she did, because everything up to that moment, the fence line conversations, the language lessons, the cornbread, had been preparation for the specific act of giving them the time to decide for themselves. Ezra looked at her. He said, "Lottie, if we go with you, things are going to come out. Things that—" He stopped. He looked at the cave floor, then up at her. "It won't be good for us." She said, "I know." "Then why are you asking?" She said, "Because whatever it is, it happened, and you can't put it back, and I'd rather you tell what happened from inside a room with walls than from inside these mountains with no way out at all. And also, because—" She stopped. She was 14. She was braver than most of the adults in this story, and she still had the ordinary courage of someone who has thought hard about something difficult. "Because I don't want to have to explain to myself that I could have asked and didn't." Enoch rose. He picked up the pack near the fire ring. He started toward the entrance. Ezra looked at the cave. at the maps on the walls, at the inscription, at the tools and ropes, and the evidence of everything they had built here. Then he followed his brother. Lottie came out of the cave last. She extinguished the torches. She followed two boys through the mountain dark toward the thin line of light at the entrance. And she thought, she said later, that it was the strangest walk of her life. Not because she was frightened, because she wasn't. And she knew she should be, and she didn't fully understand what that meant about her or about them. When they emerged from the cave, the light was late afternoon gold across the ridge, the kind of light that makes everything look briefly beautiful and briefly forgiven, which is the particular cruelty of late afternoon light in the mountains. It doesn't last. She brought them down to the road. She brought them to the constable's office herself, walking between them. The constable's report notes, defendants delivered by one Lahi French, age 14, of the French farm on the North Watauga Road. Miss French stated that the defendants had surrendered voluntarily. Neither defendant was restrained during transport. Neither offered resistance. The vocal defendant asked the constable for a glass of water and did not speak further that day. The other defendant did not speak at all. She was small for her age, or perhaps it was just that the adults in the room were large, in the particular way of people who have staked a great deal on the outcome of proceedings. She wore a dress that was clean and carefully pressed, and that looked as though it had been pressed very recently, in the particular way that suggests it was done the night before by someone who wanted to make a good impression and was not entirely sure how much that was going to matter. She sat on the milking stool with her hands in her lap and looked at the room the way she appeared to look at most things, carefully and without flinching. Clay questioned her about how she came to find the twins. She described the process in the same patient, thorough way she appeared to do most things. Clay asked her about the cave and its contents. She described it. Then Clay asked her the question the room had been waiting for since her name had first been entered into the record. He asked, Miss French, during the time you spent in the cave with the defendants, and in your prior conversations with the defendant Ezra, did either of them make any statements to you regarding the disappearances of Obadiah Fenn or R. Holsclaw? Lottie was quiet for a moment. She looked at the twins. They looked back at her. There was something in that exchange, some private communication that didn't require a private language, just two people who had made an agreement in a cave about what would and wouldn't be said, that every observer in the barn felt without being able to articulate. Then Lottie said, I was told things in confidence. Clay said, Miss French, this is a court of law. I know what it is, she said, not rudely, just as a fact. Clay pressed her. He cited her legal obligations. He was not unkind about it. He was, in fact, noticeably gentler with her than he had been with any other witness. But he pressed. She said, I can tell you what I know. I know that Obadiah Fenn walked that road for years. I know that the road has a lot of history on it. I know that not everyone who walks through these mountains has clean hands. A pause. I can't tell you what they told me. I can tell you what I believe. I believe those boys were in a place by the time those men disappeared, a place that none of the adults who put them there would like to be held responsible for creating. I believe that what happened on that mountain is more complicated than any charge I've heard read in this room. Clay said, Miss French, with respect, the question of the charge is for this court to determine, not for you. She said, then determine it, but determine all of it, not just the part that happened in the mountains. Monroe intervened. He thanked Lottie for her testimony. He noted for the record that a refusal to divulge confidential communications would be considered in the context of the proceedings. He asked her one question himself, which was not typical for a circuit judge, but which everyone in the room felt was necessary. Miss French, in your time with the defendants, in your knowledge of them, in your honest assessment of what you know, are you afraid of them? Lottie looked at the twins. A real look, not a courtroom look. A look that acknowledged them directly as the people they were. Then she looked at the judge. She said, No, sir. I'm afraid of the world that made them. They just live in it. She stepped down. As she passed the defendant's bench, she stopped, the way Martha had stopped, though for entirely different reasons. And she said something to both of them. Farwell could not hear it, but he could see them. He wrote. Ezra Slade looked at her and nodded once, the short, definite nod of someone accepting something they have thought about for a long time. The quiet one, the one who never speaks, looked at her for a long moment and then reached out with both hands, as far as the chains would allow, and she took them in hers for just a moment, and then she let go. She walked out of the barn, and she did not look back, and I thought, of all the things I will carry from this week, that will be one of them. The evidentiary portion of the trial concluded late on October 17th. Monroe recessed the proceedings until the following morning, citing the need for adequate time to consider complex material, which was an understatement of considerable proportion. The night of October 17th is not in the official record, but Farwell, who was staying at the same boarding house as the judge, wrote about it. He wrote that he heard Monroe's lamp burning until past midnight. He wrote that he passed the judge's door at some point after 11 and heard, very distinctly, the sound of a man talking, not to another person, but to himself, the way people do when they are working something out that requires an external voice. When Monroe opened the morning session on October 18th, he looked, Farwell wrote, like a man who has kept vigil and come through it without breaking, but not without cost. Monroe addressed the court before the jury's deliberation was announced. His remarks were entered into the official record, and this portion of the transcript is, notably, intact. He said, This court has heard testimony establishing that Ezra and Enoch Slade, minors of 16 years, are connected to the following events: the destruction of a camp belonging to Samuel Teague, the liberation of 4 persons held in that camp, the disappearance of Obadiah Fenn, and the disappearance of R. Holsclaw. The evidence on the first 2 counts is clear and was admitted by the defendants. The evidence on the latter 2 counts is circumstantial, but, in the judgment of this court, sufficient to bring to a jury. I want to say something further, as is within my judicial discretion, and I want it entered into the permanent record of this proceeding. I have considered, in my deliberation, whether the concept of mitigation, of circumstances that do not excuse an action, but that a court of conscience cannot ignore in determining response, applies in this matter. I have concluded that it does. I have concluded that the record in this case, documents with painful clarity a chain of failures by adults and institutions that produce two children capable of whatever they are capable of. I do not say this to transfer responsibility. I say it because this court has an obligation to honesty that supersedes its obligation to narrative simplicity. I have also considered the question of whether two 16-year-old children tried in a converted barn before a jury of men who are their neighbors, relatives, or enemies can receive anything resembling a fair verdict. I have concluded that they cannot, not entirely. This is a limitation of our current institution that I record here with regret. The jury will deliberate. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. The barn during those 6 hours became a contained world of its own. People did not leave, or most did not, because leaving felt like abandonment of something unfinished. They talked quietly, or not at all. Several people cried at various points, though no one would subsequently admit to having done so. Martha Slade sat in the front row and looked at the empty defendant's bench for most of the 6 hours, and several observers noted that her expression was one they could not find a word for. That was precise enough. The twins were held in a small room behind the barn. There was a guard at the door, who later told a journalist that he had heard them speaking the twin language the entire time. Not urgently, not distressed, but conversational, the way people talk when they are keeping each other company in a long wait. When the jury returned, Monroe read the verdict with the same deliberate weight he had given to the charges at the opening of proceedings. On the charge of destruction of property, guilty. On the charge of assault of Samuel Teague, guilty, with a notation from the jury that read in full, though we note the circumstances of the assault include conduct by the victim that this jury regards as relevant. On the charge of liberating persons held in custody, guilty, with a second jury notation. We, several of us, find our conscience in conflict with our legal obligation on this count and record that conflict here. On the disappearance of Obadiah Fenn, the verdict was not guilty by reason of insufficient evidence, with the notation, we cannot convict on what we have. On the disappearance of R. Holsclaw, here the transcript states that the jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict and that Monroe accepted this as a hung finding on that count. And on the final charge, the charge whose content is missing from pages 9 through 11, the charge that made a woman leave the barn and not come back, the jury found not proven. This is not the same as not guilty. In North Carolina law in 1855, not proven was an unusual verdict, borrowed from Scottish practice, rarely invoked. That meant, we believe something happened here, but we cannot prove it to the required standard. It was, in the language of the time, the law's acknowledgement of its own limitations. Monroe studied the verdict for a long time. Then he sentenced the defendants on the counts for which they had been found guilty. The sentence was 2 years supervised labor at a county work farm, to be followed by permanent removal from Watauga County upon release. The room erupted. Ferris Clay rose immediately. He called the sentence inadequate. He called it an insult to the families of the missing. He was, in fairness to him, not wrong on either count. Monroe waited for the noise to settle. He said, I have sentenced these defendants to the maximum available under the counts on which they were convicted. I have not sentenced them for acts they were not proven to have committed, because that is not the law's function, regardless of what we believe in our private hearts. Clay said, Your Honor, There are families. Monroe said, Mr. Clay, I am aware. I am also aware that there are 2 boys in this room who have been in the custody of this court for 23 days and who have not, in those 23 days, been visited by a single adult from their communities. No family, no neighbor, no church member, no one except one 14-year-old girl who comes every day and sits outside their door. The room was very still. Monroe said, When we have finished being appalled by what those boys may have become, I would ask this community to spend some portion of that same energy examining what they were before all of this and what we did about it. He struck the gavel once. Court is adjourned. The twins served their sentence. The court records of the work farm where they were held are sparse, as was common for such institutions. What they contain is a brief note from the farm's overseer, made when the twins arrived. 2 boys, identical. One speaks, one doesn't, mostly. Both work without being told twice. The quiet one watches everything. And another note, made approximately 8 months into their term. The vocal one has taken to teaching the other workers in the evenings. Letters, figures, basic reading. Does this of his own initiative. Has not been asked to stop. And a final note. From the day before their release, 2 years after their sentencing. They were informed this morning of their release date. They did not celebrate. They looked at each other and spoke in their language briefly. Then they asked if they could spend one more day completing a drainage ditch they had started. Permission was granted. They completed the ditch. They left the following morning at first light, without fanfare, together. Their subsequent lives are not in the record. This is not unusual. The historical record swallows ordinary people constantly, especially ordinary people who have been ordered to leave and start elsewhere, and who have every reason to leave their names behind them when they go. What happened to Ezra and Enoch Slade after October of 1857 is unknown. In the spring of 1901, a woman named Lahi French, 60 years old, widowed, living in a house she had built with her late husband on a piece of land she had worked since 1870, died in Watauga County, North Carolina. She was survived by 3 children and 7 grandchildren, and by a local reputation as a woman of unusual directness and considerable warmth, a woman who kept her own counsel and who was known to have an opinion on most things, and the patience to express it precisely when it mattered. Among her effects was a leather-bound diary covering the years 1854 through 1857. Her eldest daughter, upon reading the first several pages, sealed it and packed it with a bundle of her mother's other papers, which she donated the following year to the County Historical Society with a note that read, "Mother's Diary. I believe it is of historical interest, though I confess I was not equal to reading all of it." The diary was entered into the Historical Society's collection in 1903, where it was catalogued, given a shelf number, placed in a cedar box to protect it from moisture, and, as far as anyone has been able to determine, never read again. The final entry, dated October 18th, 1901, exactly 46 years after the trial in the converted barn, reads as follows. It is written in a hand that shows the slight tremor of age, but the deliberateness of someone who has been thinking about what they are going to write for a very long time. I am 60 years old today. I have been 60 years thinking about what I know, and what I am allowed to say about it. I knew those boys before they were what the court said they were. I knew them in the time between, in the caves, in the mountains, in the long hour when a person is still becoming. I knew them when they were two children who had been broken in specific ways by specific people and who had built something in the wreckage that was frightening. And also, in some particular way, I have never been able to fully articulate something that looked like love. Love between two people who had no one else. Love that had gone somewhere it could not come back from. I have been asked, in the years since, what they told me in that cave. I have never answered. I do not intend to answer now. What I will say, and what I want recorded somewhere for someone who might one day want to understand, rather than simply judge, is this. They weren't born wrong. They were made wrong. And I was the only one who saw them before. Lahi French's diary was donated to the Watauga County Historical Society in 1903. As far as we know, no one has read it since. If you think this story deserves to be remembered, if you think the Slade twins deserve to be something more than a cautionary tale with their names stripped out, let us know. Because Lahi paid attention. It seems like the least we can do.